The sun beat down on the bustling construction site, a symphony of hammering, shouting, and the rumble of heavy machinery. Today was Mark's first day. He was a fresh-faced engineer, barely out of college, armed with a degree from a prestigious university and an unshakable belief in his own brilliance. He clutched his clipboard, its pages filled with meticulously drawn plans and complex calculations, ready to revolutionize the way things were done. Mark scanned the scene, his eyes landing on a lone figure working on the foundation. It was James, a construction worker with weathered hands and a quiet demeanor. James moved with a deliberate grace, his movements honed by years of experience. To Mark's eyes, however, James's methods looked slow and inefficient. He scoffed quietly, unable to understand how someone could still be doing things the old way. He adjusted his hard hat and strode confidently toward James, ready to impart his superior knowledge. He imagined himself as a beacon of progress, bringing modern techniques to a workforce stuck in the past. Little did Mark know, this construction site was far from ordinary, and the quiet worker he was about to approach held a secret that would soon turn his world upside down. This day would be one he would never forget, a harsh lesson in humility and the importance of respecting experience. The air crackled with unspoken tension, the other workers sensing the impending clash between youthful arrogance and seasoned wisdom. James straightened up, wiping his brow with a calloused hand. He'd seen engineers like Mark before, full of book smarts but lacking the practical understanding that came from years of working in the field. He wasn't bothered by the young man's approach, he was used to it. He simply waited, a patient expression on his face, as Mark puffed out his chest and began to speak. James was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He had started in construction as a teenager, learning the trade from his father and grandfather. He'd worked his way up, mastering every skill, understanding every nuance of the job. Now he owned the company, but he still preferred to work alongside his crew, feeling the sun on his skin and the dirt beneath his feet. It kept him grounded and connected to the heart of his business. He wasn't easily intimidated by fancy degrees or complicated jargon. He knew what worked, what didn't, and why. He knew the land, the materials, and the people. He was a master of his craft, and he had earned the respect of everyone on the site, not through authority, but through competence and integrity. He was about to give Mark a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. The other workers subtly paused in their tasks, sensing the impending showdown. They knew James's quiet demeanor hid a sharp mind and an unwavering sense of justice. "Excuse me," Mark began, his voice dripping with condescension. "I couldn't help but notice your technique. It seems rather antiquated, wouldn't you say?" He gestured dismissively at the foundation James was working on. "We have much more efficient methods these days. Methods based on actual science and engineering principles." James simply raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. He knew exactly what Mark was doing, trying to assert his dominance and impress the other workers. He had seen this play out countless times before. Mark continued, oblivious to James's lack of reaction. "You're wasting time and energy doing it that way. We could be using a reinforced polymer composite, which would significantly reduce the curing time and increase the structural integrity." He tapped his clipboard for emphasis. "It's all in the specifications." The other workers exchanged glances, a mixture of amusement and apprehension in their eyes. They knew James wasn't one to back down from a challenge, but they also knew he preferred to avoid conflict. They wondered how he would handle this arrogant newcomer. A bead of sweat trickled down James's forehead, but he stood firm, his gaze steady as he listened to Mark's patronizing lecture. He knew his worth, and he wasn't about to let some fresh-out-of-college engineer belittle him in front of his crew. The stage was set for a clash of egos, a battle between theory and experience. "With all due respect, son," James finally said, his voice calm but firm, "this ground ain't exactly textbook material. We tried those fancy composites you're talking about. Didn't hold. Too much clay in the soil. Shifts with the rain. This method," he patted the foundation, "this method been holding up buildings around here for 100 years. Mark scoffed. "That's anecdotal evidence, not scientific proof. The specifications clearly state." "Specifications are written in an office," James interrupted, "not out here in the real world. I've been building in this county longer than you've been alive. I know this land. I know what works." He pointed to a nearby patch of ground. "See that discoloration? That's an old creek bed. Runs right under the site. The soil's unstable. You put that polymer stuff down, it'll crack in a year. Guarantee it. Mark, however, wasn't convinced. He was clinging to his textbook knowledge, unable to accept that experience could trump theory. But the increased efficiency. Efficiency ain't worth nothing if the building falls down, James said, his voice rising slightly. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. Especially when you're dealing with Mother Nature. The surrounding workers nodded in agreement, their loyalty clearly with James. The tension in the air thickened, the unspoken battle lines drawn. This was more than just a disagreement about construction methods, it was a clash of ideologies. Look, Mark said, his voice laced with impatience, I appreciate your local knowledge, but we have standards to uphold. We can't just ignore the latest advancements in engineering because of some hunch you have about the soil. He glanced around at the other workers, seeking their support, but they remained silent, their faces impassive. One of the older workers, a man named Earl, coughed and muttered under his breath, that hunch saved us a whole lot of trouble on the Miller project. Mark glared at Earl, then turned back to James. The point is, we're behind schedule and your methods are slowing us down. We need to implement the polymer composite foundation immediately. James sighed, realizing he wasn't getting through to Mark. He knew arguing further would be futile. The young engineer was too blinded by his own ego to see reason. He decided to try a different approach. All right, son, James said, his voice softening slightly. Tell you what, why don't you go get me the soil composition reports for the site? They should be in the site office. Take a look at the clay content, the water table levels. Then maybe you'll understand what I'm talking about. He knew the reports would confirm his assessment, but he wanted Mark to come to that conclusion himself. Perhaps with a little bit of research, the young engineer would finally open his eyes. The other workers watched with bated breath, wondering if Mark would take the bait or continue to dig his heels in. Mark, puffed up with self-importance, saw James's suggestion as a victory. Fine, he said, turning to leave. I'll humor you. But when those reports confirm what I already know, I expect you to implement the polymer composite immediately. As Mark walked away, Earl stepped forward and spoke to James in a low voice. He doesn't understand, does he, James? He doesn't understand who he's talking to. Another worker, Maria, added. He's making a fool of himself in front of everyone. James simply smiled faintly. Let him learn, he said. Sometimes, you gotta let people make their own mistakes. The workers exchanged knowing glances. They had tried to subtly warn Mark, dropping hints about James's experience and importance. But he had been too arrogant to listen. They knew James was a fair man, but he also had a limit. And Mark was quickly approaching it. The atmosphere on the site shifted. The earlier tension was replaced by a sense of anticipation. They were no longer just passive observers. They were invested in the outcome, eager to see how James would handle the situation. They respected James not just because he was their boss, but because he was one of them. He understood their struggles, valued their contributions, and always had their backs. They knew he wouldn't let Mark's disrespect go unpunished. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation. As Mark walked toward the site office, he couldn't resist one last jab. He turned back to James, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. You know, he said, a smirk playing on his lips, it's amazing how some people can get by on just experience. It's almost like they're allergic to learning new things. He chuckled, clearly pleased with his own wit. James didn't react, his face remaining impassive. But the other workers bristled. Mark's comment was not only disrespectful to James but also to them. They had all learned their trade through years of hard work and dedication, and they weren't about to let some arrogant engineer belittle their accomplishments. Mark, fueled by their silence, continued his tirade. I mean, seriously, he said, addressing the entire crew. We're in the 21st century. We have computers, simulations, advanced materials. Why would anyone cling to outdated methods when we have so much better technology at our disposal? He spread his arms wide, as if to encompass all the wonders of modern engineering. The workers shifted uncomfortably, their resentment growing with each passing word. They knew Mark was trying to impress them, to position himself as the superior intellect. But his arrogance was only alienating them further. They were loyal to James, and they weren't about to let anyone disrespect him, especially not in front of the entire crew. The air crackled with unspoken anger, the storm clouds gathering for a confrontation that was now unavoidable. Mark had crossed a line, and everyone knew it. The scene dissolved, the harsh sunlight of the construction site fading into a memory. We see James years earlier, younger but with the same steady gaze, sitting in a small, cluttered office. He's surrounded by blueprints and financial statements, his brow furrowed in concentration. He's just inherited the construction company from his father, a legacy built on hard work and integrity. His advisors are urging him to modernize, to streamline operations, to focus on profits above all else. They want him to distance himself from the field, to become a detached executive making decisions from behind a desk. But James shakes his head. "That's not how my father built this company," he says, his voice firm. "He always said the best way to understand the business is to be in the trenches, to know the work inside and out, to understand the challenges our employees face." He decides to take a different approach. He will work incognito alongside his crew, experiencing the job firsthand. He will learn their struggles, understand their needs, and ensure that the company remains true to its values. The scene shifts again, showing James working on various construction sites over the years, mastering every skill, earning the respect of his workers. He's not just the boss, he's one of them. He knows their names, their families, their stories. He understands the pride they take in their work, the challenges they face every day. The flashback ends, the image of James in the office fading back into the present. He's still standing there, on the construction site, his face impassive, listening to Mark's arrogant pronouncements. But now, the weight of his responsibility, the depth of his commitment is clear. He's not just a construction worker, he's the guardian of a legacy, the protector of his employees, and he won't let anyone disrespect them, especially not on his watch. The flashback receded, leaving James standing in the present, the weight of his dual role settling upon him. He had listened patiently to Mark's tirade, his face an unreadable mask. Inside, however, a storm was brewing. He had always believed in giving people a chance, in allowing them to learn from their mistakes. But Mark's arrogance had crossed a line, disrespecting not only him but also the entire crew. He watched as Mark disappeared into the site office, presumably to retrieve the soil composition reports. James knew exactly what those reports contained. He had commissioned them himself years ago, precisely to understand the unique challenges of building on this land. He had hoped that Mark would actually read them, that he would learn something from them. But he doubted it. The other workers remained silent, their eyes fixed on James, waiting for his reaction. They knew he was a fair man, but they also knew he wouldn't tolerate disrespect. They trusted him to do what was right. James took a deep breath, composing himself. He knew he had to act decisively, to send a message that arrogance and disrespect would not be tolerated on his sites. He decided to give Mark one last chance, a chance to redeem himself, to show that he was willing to learn from his mistakes. But if Mark failed to seize that opportunity, James would have no choice but to take action. The moment of reckoning was fast approaching. Mark emerged from the site office, clutching a stack of papers. He approached James, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Well," he said, "I've reviewed the soil composition reports, and as I suspected, they confirmed that a polymer composite foundation is perfectly viable." He hadn't actually read the reports carefully, but he was determined to maintain his position of authority. James simply nodded, his expression still unreadable. "That's interesting," he said calmly. "Tell me, son, considering the expansive clay content we're dealing with and the proximity to the old creek bed, what specific measures would you take to mitigate the risk of differential settlement?" Mark's smirk faltered. He hadn't anticipated such a specific question. He knew the general principles of structural integrity, but he lacked the practical experience to apply them to this particular situation. He stammered, trying to recall the relevant information from his textbooks. "Well," he said, "we would ensure proper compaction and use appropriate drainage techniques." James pressed him further. "What type of compaction? What drainage techniques? Be specific. What's the optimal compaction rate for this type of clay? What's the minimum diameter for the drainage pipes? And how would you ensure that the drainage system doesn't exacerbate the erosion around the old creek bed?" Mark's face flushed red. He realized he was out of his depth. He had memorized the theories, but he hadn't grasped the practical application. He had underestimated James's knowledge and experience. The other workers watched with growing amusement, sensing Mark's discomfort. The tide was turning. Mark stammered, his face growing increasingly red. He shuffled through the papers in his hand, desperately searching for an answer. But the reports were filled with technical data, meaningless without the context of practical experience. He realized he had been caught out, his arrogance exposed for all to see. "Well," he stammered, the specifications they outline, the appropriate measures." His voice trailed off, his confidence completely shattered. He knew he was making a fool of himself, but he couldn't stop. He was trapped in a web of his own making, his ego having led him to this humiliating moment. The other workers, who had been silently observing the exchange, began to smirk. They had seen this happen before, young engineers, fresh out of college, thinking they knew everything, only to be humbled by the reality of the construction site. They had tried to warn Mark, to subtly hint at James's importance, but he had been too arrogant to listen. Now, they were enjoying his discomfort, relishing the moment when the arrogant engineer was finally brought down to earth. They exchanged knowing glances, a sense of camaraderie uniting them in their shared amusement. Even Earl, the gruffest of the crew, cracked a faint smile. The air, which had been thick with tension just moments before, was now filled with a quiet sense of satisfaction. James had won, not through anger or confrontation, but through knowledge and experience. He was about to deliver the final blow. MES stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. He removed his hard hat, revealing a neatly trimmed haircut. He then took off his work gloves, slowly and deliberately, placing them on a nearby toolbox. He looked directly at Mark, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "Mark," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I think it's time you knew something." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The other workers held their breath, anticipating the moment of truth. "My name is James Thompson," he continued, "and I'm the owner of Thompson Construction." Mark's jaw dropped. His face paled. He stared at James in disbelief, his mind struggling to process the information. He had just spent the last hour berating and condescending to the owner of the company, completely unaware of his true identity. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The other workers erupted in murmurs of amusement and satisfaction. They had known all along, of course, but seeing Mark's reaction was priceless. They had tried to warn him, to drop subtle hints, but he had been too blinded by his own arrogance to see the truth. Mark stood frozen, speechless, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The papers slipped from his grasp, scattering on the ground. He had made a colossal mistake, and he knew he was about to pay the price. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant rumble of construction equipment. All eyes were on James, waiting to see what he would do next. The moment of reckoning had arrived. MES took a step closer to Mark, his voice resonating with authority. "Mark," he said, "I believe in giving everyone a chance, in fostering a learning environment. But I also believe in respect. Respect for experience, respect for hard work, and respect for the people who dedicate their lives to building this company." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the other workers. "Here at Thompson Construction, we value knowledge, of course. But we value practical experience even more. And we value humility above all else. Arrogance has no place on my sites." He turned back to Mark, his expression stern. "You came here today, fresh out of college, and immediately dismissed the expertise of a man who has been building in this county for longer than you've been alive. You belittled his methods, you questioned his judgment, and you disrespected him in front of his entire crew. That's not acceptable," James continued. "It's not acceptable to me, and it's not acceptable to the people who work here." He sighed, a hint of sadness in his voice. "I had hoped you would learn from your mistakes, that you would recognize the value of experience and the importance of humility. But you didn't. You chose to cling to your arrogance, to your belief that textbook knowledge is superior to practical wisdom." He shook his head slowly. "And that, Mark, is why I have to let you go." The other workers nodded in agreement, their faces grim. Justice was about to be served. "Mark," James said, his voice now tinged with a hint of regret, "your services are no longer required here at Thompson Construction." He delivered the words with a heavy heart, knowing the impact they would have on the young engineer's career. He truly believed in giving people second chances, but Mark's actions had left him with no other choice. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Mark stood there, stunned into silence, the full weight of his actions crashing down upon him. He had been so confident, so arrogant, so sure of his own superiority. Now he was jobless, humiliated, and facing the consequences of his own hubris. The other workers watched in silence, their expressions a mixture of satisfaction and pity. They knew James was a fair man, but they also knew he wouldn't tolerate disrespect. They had tried to warn Mark, to subtly hint at his mistake, but he had been too arrogant to listen. James turned to Earl. "Earl, can you make sure Mark gets his things and escort him off the property?" Earl nodded, his face grim. He approached Mark, his hand outstretched. "Come on, son," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Let's get you packed up." Mark didn't resist. He moved like a puppet, his eyes blank, his mind reeling. He had come to this construction site with such high hopes, with such a belief in his own potential. Now his career was in ruins, all because of his own arrogance and disrespect. He had learned a valuable lesson, but it had come at a high price. As Earl led Mark away, James addressed the crew. Earl led Mark to the site office, the silence between them heavy and uncomfortable. Mark moved mechanically, his mind still reeling from the events that had just transpired. He couldn't believe how quickly everything had fallen apart. He had arrived at this construction site with such high hopes, with such a belief in his own abilities. Now he was being escorted off the property, his career in tatters. Inside the office, Mark numbly gathered his belongings. His clipboard, his plans, his hard hat, all symbols of his ambition and his shattered dreams. He stuffed them haphazardly into his bag, his hands trembling. He avoided eye contact with Earl, shame burning in his cheeks. The other workers watched from a distance, their expressions a mixture of pity and satisfaction. They had witnessed Mark's arrogance firsthand, and they knew he had brought this upon himself. They had tried to warn him, to subtly hint at James's importance, but he had been too blinded by his own ego to listen. As Mark emerged from the office, his bag slung over his shoulder, he couldn't help but glance back at the construction site. He saw James standing there, surrounded by his crew, a figure of quiet authority and respect. He realized that he had underestimated James, that he had dismissed his experience and his wisdom. And he had paid the price. He turned away, his head bowed, and walked towards the exit, his humiliation complete. The lesson he had learned was a harsh one, but it was one he would never forget. MES turned to face his crew, his expression serious but compassionate. "All right, everyone," he said, his voice clear and strong, "I want to talk about what just happened." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Here at Thompson Construction, we pride ourselves on our skills and our dedication. We value hard work, honesty, and respect. Respect for each other, respect for our clients, and respect for the trade we practice." He continued, "Formal education is important, of course. We need engineers, architects, and project managers. But education is just one piece of the puzzle. Practical experience is just as important, if not more so. And humility is essential. We all have something to learn, no matter how much we already know." He emphasized, "Never forget that. Never think you're too good to learn from someone else. Never dismiss someone's experience because they don't have a fancy degree. And always treat each other with respect." He looked at each of them in turn, his eyes conveying his sincerity. "We're a team here. We rely on each other. We support each other. And we always have each other's backs. That's what makes Thompson Construction so special. And that's what I expect from each and every one of you." He smiled warmly. "Now let's get back to work. We have a building to build." The workers nodded in agreement, their faces filled with renewed determination. They understood James's message, and they were committed to upholding the values he had instilled in them. The atmosphere on the site had shifted, the tension replaced by a sense of unity and purpose. As James finished speaking, a wave of applause rippled through the crew. The workers clapped enthusiastically, their faces beaming with pride and respect. They had always known that James was a good man, a fair boss, and a skilled craftsman. But today he had demonstrated his leadership in a way that truly resonated with them. Their applause was more than just a show of support, it was a reaffirmation of their commitment to the values that James had espoused. They believed in hard work, honesty, and respect. They valued experience, knowledge, and humility. And they were proud to be part of a company that shared those values. The applause continued for several minutes, filling the construction site with a sense of unity and purpose. The workers felt a renewed sense of camaraderie, a stronger connection to each other and to the company. They knew that they were part of something special, something that went beyond just building buildings. They were building a community, a culture of respect, and a legacy of excellence. As the applause subsided, James smiled warmly. He was grateful for their support, and he was proud to be their leader. He knew that together they could overcome any challenge and achieve any goal. He raised his hand, signaling for them to return to work. And as they dispersed, their faces filled with determination, he knew that the events of the day had made them stronger, more united, and more committed than ever before. The positive work environment that James fostered had been reaffirmed, solidifying their dedication to him and the company. James picked up his tools and returned to the foundation, his movements deliberate and purposeful. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone, but he wanted to show his crew that he was still one of them, that he was still committed to the job, and that he would never ask them to do something he wasn't willing to do himself. He worked alongside them, sharing jokes, offering advice, and lending a helping hand. He didn't lord his authority over them, he treated them as equals, as partners in a shared endeavor. He showed them, through his actions, that he valued their contributions, that he respected their skills, and that he was grateful for their dedication. The workers, in turn, responded with renewed enthusiasm and commitment. They saw that James wasn't just a boss, he was a leader, a mentor, and a friend. They admired his humility, his integrity, and his unwavering commitment to their well-being. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the construction site, the workers finished pouring the foundation. They stood back, admiring their work, a sense of accomplishment washing over them. They had faced a challenge, they had overcome it, and they had emerged stronger as a result. James smiled, his heart filled with pride. He had taught Mark a valuable lesson, but he had also reaffirmed the values that made Thompson Construction so special. He knew that as long as they remained true to those values, they would continue to build great things, both buildings and communities, for years to come. And in doing so, James earned even more respect from his team, solidifying his position as not just their boss, but their leader.